The first time I saw the silver Lexus parked in my private driveway, I thought it was a delivery mix-up. It was early Saturday morning, and I had just come back from a 12-hour hospital shift, hoping to collapse into bed. But there it was, license plate reading HOA 4 LIF blocking my garage like it owned the place. I'm Everett Elson. I own the corner lot on Maple Ridge Drive, the only house with a fully fenced side lot driveway, which I paid to have paved myself. City records listed as my private property. But someone in the HOA clearly thought private meant for HOA use. I knocked on a few doors before realizing who the car belonged to. Rochelle Patterman, the self-appointed queen of our HOA. Mid-50s, frosted tips, and that voice like she's permanently scolding a teenager. She came storming out of her house in a leopard print bathrobe and slippers like she'd been watching for me. "You're being dramatic, Everett," Rochelle said, arms crossed like she was teaching kindergarten. "That spot isn't on the HOA map, it's shared use." "Shared with who?" I asked. "The raccoons, it's on my deed." "Well, the board discussed it, and since your lot connects to the walking path, we deemed it accessible community space." "You deemed it?" I raised my eyebrows. "You and the other hens in lawn chairs," she gasped like I'd slapped her. "You're going to regret that attitude." I didn't say another word. I walked back inside, pulled up my security camera footage, and downloaded the full clip of her parking there. Then I called the towing company I used for the hospital lot. Private property, documented signage, all legal. The dispatcher laughed when I told him the license plate. By noon, Rochelle's Lexus was gone. I went out and reinstalled the "No Parking Private Property" sign she had ripped down 2 weeks ago. This time, I drilled it into a steel post and poured concrete around it. At 2, she came pounding on my door again, face redder than a fire truck. "You had my vehicle towed," she shrieked. "I did. You trespassed. You're going to pay for that. They're charging me $900. "They are," I said. "Because I told them to charge the maximum under the city code." "You don't have that authority." "No," I said. "But you don't have the right to park on my property either. Now we're even." She jabbed a finger toward my chest. "I'm bringing this to the board. You'll be fined." "For what?" "Enforcing my rights." "For being hostile to the HOA." I laughed and shut the door in her face. That night, I got an email from the board, Rochelle again, about a special meeting regarding unauthorized towing. I replied with a copy of the property deed, the footage, and a link to the city's towing ordinance. Monday morning, there were 2 cars in my driveway. One belonged to Rochelle. The other, her HOA lapdog, Sharon the treasurer. Both parked nose to nose like they were daring me to tow them again. Challenge accepted. I stood on the porch sipping lemon water, watching the tow truck operator maneuver his flatbed into position with the same calm precision I admired in surgeons. The morning was quiet, aside from the distant hum of leaf blowers, and I could just barely make out Rochelle's voice through her front window. She was on the phone, pacing like a caged animal. The driver gave me a nod. "Same deal as last time, exact same," I said. "Property line hasn't moved an inch," he chuckled. "They never learn." Within 15 minutes, both cars were gone, and I handed over the updated footage from the cameras I'd installed above the garage. This time, I made sure the HOA's newsletter box, which they mounted without consent onto my fence last year, was clearly visible in the background. Every detail mattered. By the time I walked back inside, a new email had already landed in my inbox. This one came from the HOA's compliance officer, an inflated title they gave to a guy named Kurt who once tried to ban inflatable holiday decorations because they lowered property values. The message was condescendingly formal, citing an obscure clause about interfering with board operations and threatening a lien on my property. I didn't respond. Instead, I printed the email, highlighted the phrase "interference with board operations," and attached it to a packet I'd started compiling. Pages of boundary surveys, video stills, and municipal code printouts were already clipped together in a manila folder labeled "The HOA Follies." Late that afternoon, something interesting happened. A city vehicle pulled up across the street. A code enforcement officer stepped out and started taking pictures of my driveway, of the curb, even of my trash bins. I walked out to meet him. "You hear about a complaint?" I asked. He nodded. Anonymous tip. Said you were operating an unlicensed towing business from your home. That's new, I said. Want to see my driveway deed and the tow contracts? I'd appreciate it. I showed him everything proof that the cars had been parked without permission, the signage that met city standards, and the tow company's credentials. He took his time reviewing everything, even walking the lot perimeter with me. When he got back in his car, he said, "Looks like someone's trying to weaponize the municipal code. You're in the clear." I watched him drive off and wondered just how far Rochelle was willing to go. That question was answered 2 days later, when I came home to find a fluorescent pink sticker slapped across my front door. It read, "Notice of non-compliance exterior modification without approval." I stared at it for 5 full seconds before I realized what they were referring to, the new motion sensor light I'd installed above the garage, the same one that caught Rochelle and Sharon parking in my driveway. I peeled the sticker off and walked directly to my neighbor Jeff's house. He's a retired fire marshal and the unofficial watchdog of the street. If anyone knew what kind of nonsense was going on behind the HOA curtain, it was him. "They're spiraling," Jeff said, handing me a mug of coffee. "I heard Rochelle yelling during the last board meeting. Something about you undermining authority and setting a dangerous precedent. Dangerous how? By not being scared of them." That night, I filed a formal complaint with the city's neighborhood governance office. I included every document, every photo, every incident. I also submitted a separate complaint to the Secretary of State's office, flagging the HOA's failure to follow its own bylaws when issuing fines and notices. I'd read their articles of incorporation front to back. Turns out, Rochelle had been skipping the required quarterly elections for 2 years, keeping her little empire intact through emergency extensions that were never ratified. 3 days later, I got a call from a woman named Maya Sloan, an investigator from the State Compliance Bureau. "I've reviewed your materials," she said. "It's extensive. You've documented over a dozen procedural violations. I figured if they're going to play games, I might as well keep score. Do you mind if I conduct a site visit? I'd like to speak with some of your neighbors too." "Absolutely. You'll want to talk to Jeff, 2 houses down. He's got stories." Maya came the following morning in a gray sedan with state plates. She spent the better part of the day canvassing the block, interviewing residents, collecting statements. I only saw her twice, once when she asked if she could take photos of the HOA's newsletter box on my fence, and again when she requested a copy of my security footage showing Rochelle removing the private property "no parking" sign the week before her car was towed. By sunset, the neighborhood grapevine was buzzing. Apparently, Maya had confronted Rochelle directly, asking to see the minutes of the last 3 board meetings. Rochelle refused and told her to file a request like everyone else. Not the smartest move when dealing with a state-level investigator. Later that week, the real hammer fell. A certified letter arrived from the city attorney's office. The HOA was under formal review for misappropriation of authority and procedural misconduct. The letter also mentioned pending civil penalties if found guilty of operating outside its charter. I didn't celebrate, I waited. The following Monday, Rochelle tried one last stunt. She called the police. I was in the middle of trimming hedges when a patrol car pulled up and 2 officers stepped out. They asked if I was Everett Elson and if I had forcibly removed vehicles from community property. I didn't even blink. "That's private property, not community. You want to see the deed?" They did. I handed it over. One officer radioed dispatch and confirmed the parcel number matched what was on file with the assessor's office. "Sorry, sir," he said after a minute. "Looks like she filed a false report." I tilted my head. "That a crime? It is," he said. "Especially if it's habitual." 2 days after that, Rochelle got her own visit from a pair of officers and a plainclothes investigator. She wasn't arrested, but she was cited for filing a fraudulent report and warned that any further misuse of emergency services could result in criminal charges. Word spread fast. The final nail came at the emergency HOA meeting held in Jeff's backyard under the pergola. Half the neighborhood showed up. Only Rochelle, Sharon, and Kurt refused to attend. Maya was there, clipboard in hand, along with a city liaison who explained that the HOA's authority was being suspended pending a full audit. An anonymous voice from the crowd asked what that meant for fines and restrictions. The city rep answered clearly. Until further notice, the HOA may not issue fines, enforce rules, or take any administrative action. Any prior penalties issued without a proper vote are null. The applause was loud enough to make a few porch lights flicker. Nobody parked in my driveway again. The following Thursday, I pulled into my driveway just before sunset, the air thick with that early summer stillness that comes right before a thunderstorm. I just finished a double rotation in the ER, and my only plan for the night was a cold drink and silence. But instead of peace, I found an envelope wedged under my windshield wiper. It wasn't handwritten. It was printed in that stiff Times New Roman font that made it look like a utility bill or a court summons. The return address simply read Maple Ridge HOA Legal Affairs. I didn't bother going inside. I opened it right there, leaning against the hood of my truck. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a bold header that read, Notice of Civil Intent. The body of the letter accused me of unauthorized commercial towing activity, defamation of board members, and malicious obstruction of HOA operations. They were demanding restitution for emotional distress and reputational damage, and claimed they were preparing to file a lawsuit in small claims court. I didn't laugh, I didn't even frown. What I felt was colder, like a wire tightening behind my eyes, because this wasn't just Rochelle being petty anymore. This was an organized escalation. Someone had helped her draft this, and whoever it was, they thought I'd cave at the mention of court. Instead, I made 2 calls. The first was to a friend of mine, Lacey, who worked as a paralegal for a firm that specialized in property law. The second was to the city clerk's office, where I requested copies of all official communications filed under the HOA's tax ID within the last 2 years. If they were going to pretend this was a legal battle, then I was going to make them regret ever picking up the pen. By Monday, I had Lacey sitting at my kitchen table, flipping through the documents I'd printed and arranged in chronological order. Her brow furrowed as she reached the last page. "Did you notice this?" she asked, tapping one of the older newsletters. "Depends on what you're seeing. This one references a special assessment vote that never actually occurred, says it passed unanimously, but it doesn't list any roll call." I leaned over. "That's from last fall. The one where they collected $300 from every homeowner for security upgrades." "Which were?" "A pair of plastic cameras mounted on the clubhouse." Her voice turned sharp. "That could be misappropriation of funds. Especially if the vote was never recorded properly." I nodded once. "I've already got Jeff checking with 3 other neighbors. None of them remember voting." The next step was to request the HOA's financial disclosures, a right granted under the Davis-Sterling Act, which governs HOAs in our state. They tried to stall, of course. Rochelle sent a letter claiming the records were temporarily unavailable due to reorganization, but I'd anticipated that, so I filed a formal complaint with the county auditor's office. Within the week, a forensic auditor named Benji Tan showed up unannounced at the HOA's rented office space, a converted storage unit behind the community clubhouse. What he found was worse than I expected. They had no formal bookkeeping system. Just a series of handwritten ledgers, a few loose spreadsheets, and a shoebox full of receipts. Some of those receipts were for dinners, expensive ones at a steakhouse 20 minutes away. Others were for car washes, designer handbags, and a weekend rental at a beach resort booked under Rochelle's name. None of it had ever been disclosed to the homeowners. Benji alerted the district attorney's office. A week later, an investigator named Dorian Lee requested to meet at my house. She was calm, precise, and had the kind of polite energy that made you nervous without knowing why. "Mr. Elson, we've opened an inquiry into potential embezzlement involving Maple Ridge HOA," she said, setting a thick folder on my dining table. "We have reason to believe that over $20,000 in member fees were misused over a 2-year period." I kept my voice even. "Do you have enough for charges?" "That depends." Do you have any additional documentation that shows how those funds were collected or who authorized the expenditures? I slid my packet across the table. Everything I've got is in there, including video of Rochelle admitting she parked on my property because the board deemed it accessible. She smiled faintly. That'll help. By the following weekend, Dorian had conducted interviews with 6 homeowners, including Jeff and a retired accountant named me who'd kept meticulous notes from the last 3 HOA meetings. None of those meetings had quorums. None were officially recorded. And most damning, me had a copy of the original HOA charter which clearly stated that any special assessments had to be approved by a majority vote and recorded in published minutes. Minutes that didn't exist. On Tuesday morning, Rochelle's world finally cracked. She was served with a subpoena while sipping coffee on her porch, still wearing that ridiculous leopard print robe. The look on her face wasn't anger anymore. It was disbelief. Like the rules she'd twisted for years had suddenly stopped bending, Sharon and Kurt weren't far behind. Both received notices of investigation, and both tried to deny involvement. But the bank statements told a different story. All 3 had signed off on withdrawals from the HOA account, some of them on consecutive days, with overlapping signatures. The HOA's attorney, an overworked solo practitioner, who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks, resigned the next day. He issued a public statement declaring that he had been misled by false representations from the board. That same afternoon, the county froze the HOA's assets pending the outcome of the investigation. Without access to funds, the board couldn't pay for landscaping, maintenance, or even the newsletter. The community started noticing fast. Weeds grew knee-high around the clubhouse. The pool stayed closed. The walking trail lights stopped working. And for the first time in years, nobody received a single fine in the mail. A few neighbors stepped up. Jeff organized volunteers to cut the grass around the park. Me started a temporary bulletin board near the mailboxes to keep everyone informed. And I finally slept through an entire weekend without anyone parking in my driveway, ringing my doorbell, or slapping notices on my door. But the real twist came 3 weeks later when Dorian returned with a different kind of update. We recovered communications between Rochelle and a city zoning official, she told me. Turns out, she'd been lobbying to reclassify the alleyway behind your property as an easement which would have made your driveway community accessible by default. My chest tightened. That wasn't public record. No, it wasn't. She filed the request through a private contractor, claimed it was for a proposed walking path expansion. If that had gone through, they could have invalidated your deed's language on private access. I stared at her. That's attempted property fraud, she nodded. Which is exactly how we're treating it. The arrest came quietly. No sirens, no spectacle, just 2 unmarked cruisers and a pair of plainclothes officers who walked Rochelle out of her house as calmly as if they were escorting her to brunch. Kurt and Sharon were picked up later that same day. Charges were filed for embezzlement, falsification of public documents, and conspiracy to commit property fraud. Bail was denied for Rochelle due to the risk of document tampering. The Maple Ridge HOA was officially dissolved the following month by court order. A temporary civic committee was formed in its place, made up of 5 elected homeowners. I didn't run. I had no interest in playing kingmaker. But I did agree to serve as their legal liaison for as long as it took to rebuild trust. One evening, after our first community meeting under the new system, Jeff and I stood at the edge of my driveway, watching the sun dip behind the tree line. You think she ever really believed she was helping anyone? He asked. I shrugged. I think she believed the rules didn't apply to her, same as a lot of people with just enough power to get dangerous, he nodded. Glad she picked the wrong driveway. We stood there a while longer, letting the quiet settle in. No cars parked where they shouldn't be, no threats, no notices, no fake legal letters, just peace. Earned the hard way. 2 months passed. The street had settled into a quiet rhythm, no more paper notices taped to doors, no more surveillance disguised as community patrols. The HOA was gone and no one missed it, but I knew we weren't done, not really. The real storm broke on a Tuesday morning in early August when I got a knock at my door from a man who looked like he belonged in a federal courtroom. He introduced himself as Assistant U.S. Attorney Marcus Helm, showed his badge, and asked if he could speak with me about an active investigation concerning misuse of federal grant funds by former members of the Maple Ridge HOA. I stepped aside and nodded him in. I offered him a chair, but he remained standing, scanning the room like he'd memorized the layout before stepping through the door. "I'm going to be direct, Mr. Elson," he said. "In the course of the county's investigation into the HOA's financial mismanagement, we found records indicating your development received a federal infrastructure grant 3 years ago. The funds were earmarked for community accessibility upgrades, aider ramps, sidewalk expansions, stormwater drainage. None of which were completed." I leaned against the kitchen counter. "They always claimed the budget was tight, said the reserve fund was drying up." He pulled a folder from his case and spread several pages across the table. "According to these records, the HOA received just over $91,000. The disbursement was signed for by Rochelle Patterman and 2 other board members. None of the required quarterly reports were filed. The last recorded expense tied to the grant was a payment to a landscaping company that doesn't exist." I crossed my arms. "So this wasn't just about embezzling dues. They siphoned federal money." He nodded once. "That's why I'm here. We believe this qualifies as grant fraud under federal statute. We've already frozen Rochelle's personal accounts and are preparing a case for wire fraud and conspiracy. But we need corroborating testimony from residents who were misled." "You'll have it," I said. Over the next several days, I helped Marcus organize a list of homeowners who'd been on the receiving end of Rochelle's lies about the supposed upgrades. I also pointed him toward the faded construction notice signs that had been posted 3 years ago and never replaced, one of which still leaned against the clubhouse fence, half covered in ivy. The dates had long expired, and the contractor listed was unreachable. According to the state license board, the business was dissolved the same month the grant was received. Then came the kicker. Marcus returned with a federal forensic analyst who had traced the grant funds through a series of dummy accounts tied to a company called Ridgeview Urban Consulting, registered to a P.O. box in a nearby city. The signature on the company's formation documents, Sharon's. It turned out the entire consulting firm was a shell. The funds had been funneled through Ridgeview and then withdrawn in increments just under the federal reporting threshold. Rochelle, Sharon, and Kurt had built a pipeline of siphoning off government money under the pretense of community improvement. I relayed the news to Jeff and me that night. Jeff, who just finished rebuilding the community bulletin board, sat silent for a while, then shook his head. "I can't believe we were footing the bill for their fraud," he said. "They were stealing from us and the government at the same time." Me, who'd taken over as treasurer for the interim community committee, unfolded a copy of the original grant application she'd managed to dig up from the city archives. "They even forged resident support letters," she said, holding up one signed E. Elson in handwriting that looked like a child's attempt at cursive. I took a photo of it and sent it to Marcus that night. 3 weeks later, Rochelle's trial date was set. She faced federal charges for wire fraud, conspiracy, and falsifying government documents. Sharon and Kurt were named as co-conspirators. Bail was denied for all 3 after evidence surfaced showing Rochelle had attempted to transfer property into her cousin's name in another state. The trial itself was swift. The prosecution presented bank records, email chains, phony invoices, and a damning voicemail where Rochelle bragged about moving the money before anyone notices the sidewalks are still cracked. My testimony, along with me's and Jeff's, helped establish a pattern of deliberate deception. The courtroom was packed with neighbors, some angry, some stunned, all betrayed. Not one person showed up on Rochelle's side. The jury returned a verdict in under a day, guilty on all counts. Sentencing followed a month later. Rochelle received 7 years in federal prison. Sharon got 4. Kurt, who had cooperated early, was sentenced to 2 years. and ordered to pay restitution. The court also approved a civil judgment, allowing the community to recover a portion of the stolen funds once the government auctioned off Rochelle's assets, including the Lexus that had kicked off the whole mess. In the aftermath, the city stepped in to help restructure the neighborhood's governance. The HOA charter was formally dissolved, and a new neighborhood council was established under municipal oversight. Instead of fines and threats, we now had monthly open forums where decisions were made by vote. Volunteers maintained the grounds. Jeff built a community tool shed. Me organized a Saturday repair crew that patched sidewalks and cleared storm drains, the very upgrades we were supposed to get years ago. As for me, I finally removed the last of the surveillance cameras. I didn't need them anymore. My driveway stayed empty unless I was home. The sign stayed up, but only as a reminder, cast in iron and bolted to the ground beneath a new solar-powered light I installed myself. One evening, as I walked my dog past the clubhouse, now a community center, I saw a group of kids drawing chalk murals on the sidewalk. One of them had written in giant block letters, "No more HOA." I laughed. For the first time in months, the neighborhood had changed. Not because someone rolled in and saved it, but because we stood up when it mattered. We stopped letting power go unchecked. We paid attention. We made noise, and when they parked where they didn't belong, we towed them legally, thoroughly, and with every receipt in order.